Let's go ahead and get started. I have misplaced the clicker. Here we go. All right. Let's go ahead and pray. Great God of heaven, thank you so much for your goodness and grace. Lord, we thank you for the book of Job, for the way that each of us bring our own stories to the book of Job, and the way that it challenges us and encourages us and informs us and strengthens us. Lord, I pray for us today that you would help us to begin to understand some of your richness through your first speech to Job. Amen. Amen. All right. So I'm getting a little bit of a late start here. I wanted to start with a couple of housekeeping things. The first is regarding the next 2 weeks. So next week, there's not going to be any adult Sunday school because we're doing welcoming the new members. So there's going to be a reception in here for the new members, for us to be able to get to know them, welcome them to Heartland. So there will not be any Sunday school next week, upstairs or downstairs. And then the Sunday after that is the Sunday following Thanksgiving. And so we are not going to be having Sunday school up here. I'll be preaching that Sunday morning. And so we're just not going to have Sunday school. I chatted with Greg. He said it was fine, so I have permission. So the next 2 weeks, we're not going to be doing Sunday school, but that gives us 4 weeks of content left to get through the rest of the book of Job, and I have confidence that we can do it. And so we're going to go ahead and get started here today, this morning. So first, by way of review, one of the things that I hope this class helps us with is be able to kind of get the big major building blocks of the book of Job under our belt. So you kind of go, oh, I can kind of tell you the main pieces of the book. So if you were dividing the book of Job 1 through 31, chapter 1 through 31, what would you divide the main sections into? And I even gave you a hint that I would divide it into 5 sections. So maybe take a minute, think through, like, all right, we've talked about this book for a couple of weeks now, several weeks. If you were dividing Job 1 through 31 into chunks, what are the 5 chunks that you would divide it into? And if you don't get my 5, you're wrong. Yep. So the prologue portion. So the question, of course, we could always divide it into smaller and smaller sections. So the first major section of the book of Job, I would say, is chapter 1 and 2 together, right? And there's a fancy word for that. We call that the Jobin prologue in scholarship. So when you're reading your technical commentaries, that's what the prologue is Job 1 and 2. That's the story part. That's the part of Job that we all know, right? That Job is faithful and righteous and wealthy, and the Satan comes and he talks to God, and all the terrible misfortune happens to Job, and he loses his family, and then he has the boils, and then he remains faithful, right? That's that whole bit. So that's chapters 1 and 2. That's what I would consider the first main chunk. We looked at a lot of important things in there. What was the next key chunk in the book? We spent a whole week on this, I think. Anyone? The conversations, but before we get to the conversations, what kicks off the conversations? The Job cursing the day of his birth. That's right. Job chapter 3. So in Job chapter 3, Job is not talking to his friends. That's important for us because sometimes people will say the dialogues start with Job 3. But we don't actually have a conversation in Job 3 between human speakers. Job is talking to God, and he's cursing the day of his birth, wishing that he had never been born. He even makes some claims that maybe even suggest righteousness doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it's all the same. We're all worm food. right? And that seems to be what the friends kind of pick up on and get angry about. So Job 1 and 2 is the story. Job 3 is the day of his birth, where he curses the day of his birth and says, I wish I had never been born. My suffering is so great. And then we get to the speech cycles. Now, so that's chapter 4, all the way up through chapter 27 is the speech cycles. How do those speech cycles work? What's one thing that you kind of remember from those, or that you've learned from those, about how these speech cycles function in the book, how they work? In groups of 3, that's right, there's 3 friends. Is that what you're talking about, DJ? There's 3 friends, so each of them takes a turn speaking. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, right? Those awesome strong man names, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They each take turns, and they're all telling Job why he is bad, right? Like, this is why you're suffering, and in some way it always is coming back to Job's wickedness. Okay, good. How else are they functioning? Or maybe here's a better question, right? What do we see at the end, toward the end of those speech cycles, right? At the beginning, it's very orderly. Job speaks, Eliphaz speaks. Job speaks, Bildad speaks. Job speaks, Zophar speaks. Very structured, very structured. What do we get at the end of chapters 25, 26, and 27? Does everyone get a turn in that final speech cycle? No, Zophar is completely missing. Job, it looks like, gets interrupted at some point because he has to again pick up his discourse. The speech cycles are falling apart, reflecting the chaos that us as readers are feeling, right? We're not really making much progress in the point of the book by the time we get to chapter 27. And so then we get to the next chunk number 4. So we had 1 and 2 is the narrative. Chapter 3, Job's cursing the day of his birth. 4 through 27 are the dialogue cycles. Chunk number 4 is Job 28, that hymn to wisdom, kind of the brakes to the whole book that kind of slows everything down and reminds us that wisdom comes from God, from those and from fearing God, which we were told that Job fears God in the prologue. But it kind of is a reminder, we have not yet heard the answer. Kind of concludes those dialogue cycles. And then the final chunk is Job 29 through 31, which is Job's final speech, where he cries out to God, asking to be seen and heard, crying out, asking why is the relationship in such tatters, wanting to see God face to face and holding fast to his innocence. Job never ever confesses a sin at any point during these dialogue cycles, anywhere. All right, so that brings us up to chapter 31. And then we're kind of expecting some sort of resolution, right? Maybe we're expecting God to come in at that moment, but instead we get this interrupter, Elihu, which we're going to deal with in a few weeks. We just want to note that he's here. And then after Elihu's speech, he just kind of comes on. He says his piece for 5, 6 really long chapters. It's great to write a dissertation on. And then he's just off the scene, never heard from again. It's really just fascinating. Nerd fascinating, but fascinating. And so then we're going to get to the Yahweh speeches. So, oh, look at that. I already did all that. Look at that. Okay. So the Elihu speeches, we're going to leave that to the side, 32 through 37. Then we get what's called the Yahweh speeches. Yahweh talks to Job in 4 glorious chapters. And then we get Job's confession, question mark. That's going to be something we'll have to deal with. And then Job's restoration, or what's called the epilogue at the end. So these are the main chunks of the book. If you kind of get this, you're like, all right, Cooper, there's no way I'm ever going to remember what chapters go with what. That's fine. But hopefully you're kind of able to say, you know, I could maybe tell most of this story. If you just gave me a time and we were talking through it, I could talk about how Job curses his birth. There's these dialogue cycles. There's this wisdom thing. Yahweh's going to eventually come on the scene. Job has some sort of confession we're going to deal with. And then Job gets restored at the end. And that's it. That's the whole book in a snapshot, right? And then we could spend a whole lifetime diving in and studying it. But we're going to focus today on the Yahweh speeches. Last week, we looked at Job and Jesus, how we understand this book Christianly. And I'm not even going to ask if we have questions, because that's a hard topic to talk through. Okay. So at the very end, there was a list of questions that we still need to answer for this book. This is kind of a where we're going, right? This is the coming soon features. So we have, first of all, what are we going to do with God's first speech? What does it mean? What's the significance of Job's silence? Chapter 42, nope, that's not right, 38, 39. Chapter 40 starts by Job saying that he is going to be silent before God. I've spoken things that I don't understand, things that are too great for me. I will close my mouth and no longer speak. Job is silent. What are we going to do with that? Is that good? Is that bad? Is it sufficient? What are we going to do with Job's silence? Then we come to God's second speech. That's the Leviathan and the Behemoth passage, right? If you've ever talked about the Leviathan and Behemoth in the book of Job, that's where we come from in God's second speech. What do we do with Job's confession? What do we do with God's condemnation of the three friends and the commendation of Job? And then what do we do with Job's restoration? Job is restored at the end, double everything that he's lost. How does that factor into what we're supposed to do with the book? Is his righteousness being rewarded? Does the epilogue completely undermine the message of the whole book and show that all you have to do to be rich and faithful is to persevere? What do we do with the restoration at the end? So these are the questions that we have left to answer in our 4 weeks together. Oh yeah, and what do we do with Elihu? Of course. So this is what we're going to focus on today. What do we do with God's first speech? And what's the significance of Job's silence? After Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving week, we're going to be looking at the next 2 questions, maybe the silence question, depends how fast I am today. And then we'll deal with these final 3 questions over our last week together. Okay, questions so far. That was a review, kind of where we're going. Any big questions so far? Not so far. Job joke. Okay, good thing Marie wasn't here. She would not have liked that. Okay. All right. So Yahweh's first speech. For those who are coming back to class or watching online, I strongly encourage you to read through these speeches over these next couple of weeks. Read through them once or twice in between our Sunday school if you get a chance to. The language, the content that we're going to go over, to have that frame of reference is going to be really helpful. This is the climax of the book. We just have to kind of figure out how it relates. Okay, so what do we do with Yahweh's first speech? And so the first question is, what is the setting of this speech, right? What are the important pieces and furniture that's in place, where and when this story takes place, and why does it matter? So 38:1 starts and says, "Then Yahweh spoke to Job out of the storm. He said," bonus points, right? Whenever you see Lord in all caps like that, well, it's called small capital letters. That means that's the word Yahweh. Our English translations, they didn't want to keep the word Yahweh, so they put the word Lord, but it's a personal name, right? It's like the name Zeus or like the name Cooper, right? Like the name is Yahweh. So Yahweh spoke to Job out of the storm and said. So yeah, what's the setting? What's going on here? Someone kind of remind us, jog our memory. Where are we going here with the setting of this speech? How does it start off? Say again. Who's in charge? Yep, God is the one who's speaking. He's showing that he's in charge. God is speaking to Job. And what's kind of happening around Job right now? God is not just coming down to Job in a still small voice, right? Where there's a weather phenomenon that's important. The storm, right? He's speaking to him out of the whirlwind, is normally how we'll talk about it. So we can open our Bibles if you have them. right? He speaks to Job out of the storm or out of the whirlwind. So the key question here, right, is why does this matter? God speaks to Job. Big deal. I mean, that is a big deal, obviously, right? But why does it matter in the book? What does God coming down, talking to Job, how does that play in the story and what it is that Job has been wanting for 37 chapters? Yes, DJ said Job finally gets God to speak up and to answer some of the questions. What is it that Job has been asking for over and over and over again? We've talked about one of the themes that's kind of come up, a trial imagery. He wants God to answer for what's going on. And the reason is because Job is worried that the relationship between Job and God has been destroyed, right? Job has a theological crisis on his hands. He's worried that his suffering and his devastation and what the friends are saying mean that there's been a fracture in the relationship between Job and God that cannot be repaired. And then God shows up. The very fact that God speaks to Job shows that the relationship has not been utterly decimated. There's still relationship there. Job has longed and said, if only you would answer me face to face. And God does. God answers him face to face. So some have even suggested that what God says in the speeches doesn't really matter because Job already has the answer just in the fact that God shows up. The fact that God shows up means that the relationship is still in place and that Job is in some sense commended for his relationship, right? That he's shown that he remains faithful. Now, I don't want to go that far because the Yahweh speeches take up 5 glorious chapters in our Bible and the content really, really matters. But just the fact of God showing up is a really big deal in the story for the book of Job. Is that making sense? Okay. All right. So what do we do with Yahweh's first speech? So this is important. Who is God talking to? This may seem easy, but in Job 38:2, Yahweh says, who is this that obscures plans, my plans, with words without knowledge? Now, the easy answer, we all think, who is he talking about here? Job. Who do we think he's talking about? Job, right? And I think you're right. But here's another proposal. Some have suggested that God here is not talking about Job, but he's talking about Elihu. He comes to Job, and it's kind of like he's looking at Job going, who is this? Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? And then, he's talking to Job about Elihu, this other guy who we didn't really study yet, and saying that basically God then would be saying, Elihu is dumb and foolish, and we don't need to listen to him. That is one, I would say, extremely minority position. But we do want to just recognize it, right? We have to ask ourselves these questions and not just take stuff at face value. Like just because he's talking to Job, this must be about Job. It is at least possible that this was about Elihu. But what I want to say, is that when you look at Job's response in chapter 40, he says, I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And then we also have, in 42, he repeats the exact words, 42:3. Job is speaking, and he says, God, you asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. So Job says, hey, I recognize that this is me. So this is a key verse in God's first speech. This is probably the key verse in God's first speech. What is the problem that Yahweh has with Job? Based on this verse, what's Job's fundamental deficiency? He's lacking knowledge. There's something that Job doesn't know. There's something that Job needs to learn. That's all that God tells him, right? And then then Yahweh gets into the speech. But this is the frame that we're given. Job, you've obscured my plans with words without knowledge. There's something that you don't know. So as a reader, we're going, okay, God is about to take Job to school. God is going to teach Job something in what follows. Okay? All right, let's keep going here. Yeah, we talked about that. Deficiency. Look at that. We're just crushing it. Okay. So, this is the really fun stuff. This is where you're going to be really glad all the money that you're paying to come to my Sunday school. Okay. So then we get to 38, 3 and 4. Yahweh's speaking, talking to Job. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. We're going to skip that one. What is God's tone in these words? Here's what I would like you to do. I want you to pair up groups, maybe one or two, or at least two, one other person, 2 or 3 people. And I want you to read these verses to each other with feeling, right? Pretend like I'm a drama coach or something, and I go, with feeling this time. Read them how you think God is speaking to Job based on these words. And for bonus points, you could look up chapter 38, verse 21, and read that one as well to your partner or partners. Surely you know, for you were already born, you've lived so many years. And asking yourself, what is God's tone toward Job in these verses? So take a couple minutes, do your dramatic readings, really get into the character and get into the words and read them to each other. Take turns reading them to each other. If you want the handouts, they're over on the podium over there. It's worth their weight in gold. So we're reading verses 3 and 4 to each other with feeling. So it should be on the back of the handout. Oh no, I didn't put the verses there. It's those ones up there. So read them like this is God talking to Job. What is the tone and force behind God's words? Oh, shoot. Okay. All right, maybe about 15 or 20 more seconds. All right. All right. This is where I wish I had a stool so that I could just sit down, because when I stand up here, it's like, oh, I have to give all the answers. But, well, the chair's too low. You gotta have a little height. So, what did you think, right? As you're reading this, what kind of tone are you giving Yahweh? How is he talking to Job? Scolding him. How many of you, I mean, I heard that word come from two of you at the exact same time. Would anyone else use that same word? Did you kind of have that same idea in your mind? How about the word sarcasm? Did any of you read it sarcastically? Right? I mean, it's pretty easy, right? Especially the end. Surely you know, right? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know, you dummy. Right? Say again. 21. Yeah, especially verse 21. So if you had your Bibles, 38:21 again. Surely you know, for you were already born. You've lived so many years, right? This is the common way of reading the Yahweh speeches. And without knowing it, it always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. You know, with God coming in and scolding Job in words that come off sarcastically, it's always seemed, I don't know, right? Like a little ungodlike. Am I allowed to say that? Does anyone else kind of feel some of that pressure? You're like, this is someone who's been suffering tremendously, who's had 27 chapters of the friends scolding him and ridiculing him, and they have used sarcasm, and it seems like God just comes in and uses the same weapon that the friends have used against Job, and he uses it and wields it against Job. I think it's understandable why we take them sarcastically. Yeah, so is there something else that we can do with these chapters? That's a great question. Yeah, Renee? Yeah, is it kind of a reality check? And this is, remember, what's Job's deficiency in the first speech that God is trying to fix? Job has a lack of knowledge. What are the kinds of questions that God asks Job? Look in your Bibles and pick one or two of them. Let's talk through them. What are the questions that he's actually asking him? What about the beginning of the world, DJ? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Is this information, what's the answer to that, right? Obviously the answer is no. But notice what I just said. Obviously, the answer is no. Was Job learning anything new with this question? No. Okay, what are some other questions that we get from this chapter, from these two speeches? What verse are we looking at, Terry? Verse 34, 38, 34. Yep, can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Again, obviously, the answer is no. We have, these are called rhetorical questions. These are questions that don't expect an answer because the answer is so obvious. This is really interesting. God, the deficiency with Job is a lack of knowledge, but God does not reveal to Job any new content in chapters 38 and 39. He doesn't reveal to him anything that he doesn't already have cognitive awareness of. Right? This could have been the time when God says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? You don't even know about the wager that's going on in heaven." That would be brand new information. That would be information that Job did not know about and could make sense. And all of a sudden, Job goes, "Oh yeah, there were things that I didn't know. Turns out this is part of a larger story. I missed that." Or God could have revealed the cosmic reason for all human suffering, right? And said, "Job, you kind of have missed the point. Let me explain to you how I relate to suffering and permitting it for certain kinds of reasons under certain conditions. And this is how it applies to your specific situation." Job would go, "Oh, the light comes on. This is brand new information that I did not know before." But that's not at all what we have here. Job is going to school to learn things that he already knows. So I think there's a more helpful way for us to think through these questions, right? So the theme of the questions is relating to God's greatness over all of creation, right? That's kind of what he's reminding Job of, this content. He's reminding Job. So the Job's lack of knowledge is not a deficiency in his learning. It's a lack of remembering, right? So we get this language sometimes in the Old Testament where it says things like, "And God remembered his people." It uses that exact language, remembered his people. That doesn't mean that God forgot and then all of a sudden was walking around in heaven and was like, "Oh, I've got people down there. I totally forgot about them. Let me go and see. Oh, they're in Egypt. Whoops, that was a mistake." Right? It's not like he remembers them. It means that he's acting on the knowledge that he has, right? He's remembering them in a certain kind of way. So when Job has a lack of knowledge, what Job needs to do is remember. Not learn it something new, but to be reminded of what he already knows and how it relates in a certain kind of way. So I think there's a common way of reading these verses. Trimper Longman, a brilliant Old Testament scholar who I've learned a ton from on the book of Job and Proverbs, says God does not wait for Job's responses because he knows that he has none to offer. There's other scholars that will be even harsher, right? That God is here scolding Job. I think it's better to read these questions earnestly. That God is truly reaching out to someone who fears him, who is blameless and upright, who turns away from evil, who is in a moment of profound suffering after this terrible struggle with the friends, and he reaches down out of the whirlwind, but not in sarcasm, but in genuinely reminding Job of what he already knows. Rhetorical questions serve a purpose. They don't teach new information. They remind you of what you already know so that you know it. And I know that you're thinking about the right answer. Right? So imagine if Yahweh, instead of asking these questions sarcastically, asked them something like this. Job, come on. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You know this. You know who lays the foundations of the earth. Where were you when I bounded the seas and their edges together? Come on. Job, you know these answers. You know who controls the reins. You know who controls and who puts the pillars of the earth on its axis. Who does it? Are you able to do it? Who does it? All of a sudden, that tone is a lot more restorative and relational. And that seems to fit with what we're expecting from God in this kind of moment. I find that reading of the questions, a sincere reading, perhaps even a playful reading, right? That he is, in a sense, playing with these ideas and these concepts and with Job, to be much more compelling than a scolding reading. He's reminding Job of what he already knows. And I think that's important too, for this reason. This is the only answer that Job is going to get to why he suffers. This is it. He never gets told about the wager and the Satan in heaven. He never gets told that. So here's why I think this matters for us. Do we have access to all of the things that God is reminding Job of? Do we know those answers? We do. We know all of these answers. In chapter 38 and 39, who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? I know that one, God. Who made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? Oh, I know that one, God. Right? Like, you and I know these answers. If God pulled back the curtain here and told Job the reason for his sufferings as it relates to the divine wager, this book becomes completely irrelevant for you and me. Because what that's telling us is that we can only have sufficient answers for our suffering if God pulls back the curtain and gives us the God's eye view on why our specific suffering is happening in that moment. Are we following? How many of us are lost right now? Okay, maybe you're not. Some? Paul? This is the answer that there is an answer, and that this is the thing that God gives Job. We haven't gotten all the way there yet, but we're getting there, right? This is the first part of God's answer. He gives him two answers, and the first part is these questions in chapter 38. And so we haven't even finished that part yet, but the important thing to know is he doesn't tell him the God's eye reason for it. Right. That's right. God is on the throne. God's in control. Right. So then we have Michael Fox, who gives us a different reading, the reading that I prefer. God's not quizzing Job. He's not trying to squelch him by stumping him with hard questions. God overwhelms Job by showing him the obvious, by opening his eyes to what he already knows. He's reminding Job of what he already knows. Okay. So what's the point then? If we were summarizing God's point to Job in chapter 38, what is it? Let's look at a couple of what I consider to be really key verses for summarizing God's point. What is it that he's really reminding him of? He asked him in 38:26, who is it that waters a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert? This is an interesting question. He's the one in control, but what's interesting about the desert, this question with the desert, is what good is rain in a desert according to Job, right? The way that this sounds. He waters a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert. Now, some of us may be thinking, well, ecologically, rain in the desert is really important because there are animals and there's flora and fauna and blah, 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 right? But according to the way that Job is presenting it, he goes, who is it that causes this rain in a desert where no one even lives? There's no obvious benefit to it. That's a really interesting question. God is reminding Job that even when there's no one around to benefit, I still do certain kinds of things, like causing rain in the desert. I have that authority. I'm God. I'm the one that's in charge. But there's something extra that God is doing here. He's not just saying I'm in charge. He's saying I'm in charge in a certain kind of way. Let's look at the next verse. Oh, you guys, something like this? Yes, even when you're not aware of the purpose. So when we look at 38, 39. Yeah, so this is when he's going through the animals. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions? Obviously, Job doesn't do that. When they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket. Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? You get this great lesson at the end of chapter 39 on this foolish ostrich who leaves its eggs on the ground unattended, able to just be smashed by any passerby. God is reminding Job that he's in charge, but that God's control is more than just justice. God rules the world by more, but certainly not less, than justice alone. There's other kinds of purposes of God at work, right? So if I were summarize, I would say God's active governing of creation is broader than justice alone. This is what God is reminding Job of by asking these questions that Job already knows the answer to. Now, I don't think that this is the fullness of the answer to Job's suffering in the book. And our author doesn't think that it's the fullness of the answer because he has God go on and give a whole nother speech with a whole different point about Behemoth and Leviathan. But I think that this is an important point in our book as we're learning why is it that God allows suffering. He doesn't tell Job the God's eye view, but he just reminds Job, I control the universe, but I'm not just, it's not like I'm just a disinterested watchmaker, right? Or I'm not like the God Allah in Islam, who is so separate from his creation that you can't ever be sure whether you're going to go to paradise or not, because Allah could just change his mind and change the rules on a whim. Right? God says, I rule the world by more than just mere justice. I'm also concerned with showering the deserts. I'm concerned with ravens and with wild donkeys and with ostriches. These are some of the things that I am concerned about. These are some of the ways and some of the concerns that I balance along with justice. So it's not that I am unjust, but I am more than just just. There's other things, Job, that go into this world. How is that a partially helpful answer for Job? Or for you, for us, how is it partially helpful? Yeah, okay, good. It increases trust with him, to him, is DJ's point. Love. Here's the thing about the book of Job, right? We asked at the end of last week, how does this book work to shape us and to shape our minds, right? By presenting this story and forcing us to walk with Job and to go through all of these chapters, these points take on a different kind of force. Right? If I were to start and I were to say, well, the first part of God's answer to why suffering is God rules the world by more than mere justice alone, that's not fully satisfying. It's not fully satisfying now. But there's a sense in which, after having sat with Job for weeks and weeks and felt his suffering, to then hear the words of God remind him of these truths that he already knows, for me, it does take on a kind of significance that's more satisfying than just a mere answer, right? Like Job 1:1, God's active governing of creation is broader than justice alone. Job could have been a really short book if that's how the book was supposed to work. But God doesn't want it to work that way. He wants us to go through this. Any thoughts on that, reflections on that? Does this going through the process make this point strike you differently? Just me? Faith building. How so, DJ? Yeah, faith, but there's a point to it, right? And being reminded, like, this is not some special revelation that Job is getting here. This is not some extra biblical thing that he needed that God thought Job needed, right? God gives Job answers that we already know the answer to as well. We have access to the same level of comfort and answer that God gave to Job. I find that satisfying. I at least find it satisfying that God thought it was satisfying, right? God has decided this is the answer that Job is going to get, and this is an answer that you also can have access to in your individual case of suffering. You're not going to get the God's eye view. Yeah. What about Job being upright and blameless, Krista? Right. This is the answer that Job gets, the blameless and upright man. And Krista's saying she's not perfect. She didn't say that about me. I want everyone to be clear. That since she isn't perfect, since we aren't perfect, what could we ask for more? That kind of question, right? Like if the most blameless and upright man who ever lived gets descriptions unlike Abraham, unlike Moses, unlike David, if he gets this answer, what more can we hope for? This is the most that we can hope for is Job's answer. Although in some ways we do get a little more, right? Because we know chapters 1 and 2. # spoiler alert. Yeah. Yep. No. That's right. No, I think, so Renee's point is, does this help take the focus off of us and show that God's scope of vision is wider than our individual circumstance? I think that is a profoundly important point. And I think that's exactly the idea that God is getting at here. He's saying, Job, in your experience, your field of vision is 100% consumed with your own situation and your own suffering. But me, in my God's eye view, I'm able to take 100 steps back and see how your scope of suffering fits into this much larger, more beautiful picture. The darkness and the shadows in paintings are required in order to make the paintings beautiful, right? That kind of idea. I think that you're exactly right, Renee. This kind of raises to our minds, wait a minute, it's about a much more than just my individual situation. It's not about that, but it's not only about that. Catherine. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Catherine asked a great question. She said, Elihu, when he starts off in chapter 32, it says Elihu became angry. It actually mentions Elihu's anger 4 or 5 times in the first 2 verses. Before we even get his name in Hebrew, we get that he's angry. So anger is one of the chief characteristics of Elihu. He's angry with the friends. He's angry with Job. And Catherine's question is Elihu right to be angry with Job? It's a great question. I'm not going to answer that. I'm not even going to answer that at the end of the class. But I'll tell you why when we get to the Elihu speeches. Because here's the thing. In the book of Job, are we told whether Elihu was right or wrong? No. We are never told if Elihu was right or wrong. We're told that the friends were in some degree wrong, and we're told that Job in some degree was right. We get bupkis about Elihu. And I think that's important. And we'll talk about why that's important and what that does to us as interpreters when we get to the Elihu speeches at the end of the class. So we kind of skip him, and then we're going to come back to him because I think he kind of is like a pop quiz at the end of the book. So he's kind of our final exam is what we're going to do with Elihu. Okay. So unsurprisingly, we did not get as far as I wanted today. So we're going to talk next class about Job's silence. So this is after 3 weeks from now, right? So not next week, we're going to have the new member reception. The week after that, I'm preaching. And so we'll get back together. I think that's the first week in December. We're going to look at God's second speech. And that's really where things get fun. You know, this was fun. Wait till we start going with Leviathan and Behemoth. And what's he doing there? And how's that functioning? Is Job's silence a sufficient answer? Oh, so many fun things. So again, I encourage you, read through these Yahweh speeches. And read them with different tones and ask yourself what seems satisfying. Which one seems right to you based on the text that we have? Does it seem like God is scolding Job based on what we know about God in the book of Job and everywhere else? Or does it seem like he's inviting Job into this community of knowledge to remind him of what he already knows? Okay?